Have you ever wondered what happens when they take everything from you, your family, your land, your crown, but they cannot take your mind? Tonight, I'm going to tell you about a man whose name was deliberately erased from every document, every ledger, every record that ever mentioned him. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. They erased his name not because he was insignificant, but precisely because he was too dangerous to remember. Picture this. Somewhere in the coastal archives of Virginia, there exists a single faded letter from 1742. The paper is so brittle now that archivists wear special gloves just to handle it. In that letter, a plantation owner writes to his cousin in England, and he describes, with barely concealed terror, a slave who speaks as if he once commanded armies and reads the stars like a general reads a battlefield. That slave had no name, or rather, he had no name they would write down. What I'm about to share with you took me months to piece together from scattered fragments, shipping manifests, coded letters between plantation owners, even songs that enslaved people sang in the fields that encoded memories they weren't supposed to keep. If you're the kind of person who believes that history owes us the truth, even when that truth makes powerful people uncomfortable, then you're exactly who this story was meant for. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear will fundamentally change how you understand the colonial American South. This is the story of the man they tried to erase, the strategist who wore chains, the king who became property, and the reason, the terrifying reason, they never dared write his real name. Let's begin. The James River moves slow in August. Slow like it's carrying secrets it doesn't want to deliver. Slow like it knows what happened on its banks and has decided, after 3 centuries, that silence is safer than testimony. If you walk along the northern shore today, about 40 miles upstream from where the river meets the Chesapeake, you'll find a peculiar clearing. The locals don't build there. They say the ground is wrong somehow. Too soft in some places, too hard in others, as if the earth itself remembers something it refuses to fully bury. There used to be a plantation here. The Harwood Estate, they called it, though that name appears in fewer and fewer records as the years pass. The main house burned in 1784, but not from any accident. The fire started in 7 places at once, simultaneously, as if orchestrated by someone who understood that a single flame can be extinguished, but 7 flames become a declaration. No one was ever charged. No one was ever questioned. The Harwood family, what remained of them, simply vanished from Virginia society like smoke dispersing into an indifferent sky. But this story doesn't begin with fire. It begins with water. Salt water, specifically, and the particular hell of a ship's hold during the Middle Passage in the autumn of 1739. There is a question that scholars have debated for decades, a question that most history books avoid entirely because the answer makes people uncomfortable. How did the colonial plantation system maintain control over populations of enslaved people, who often outnumbered their captors by ratios of 10 to 1, sometimes 20 to 1? The conventional answer involves violence, which is partly true. But violence alone cannot explain the architecture of control. Violence alone cannot explain how the system sustained itself for generations. The real answer is more disturbing. The system worked because it was designed by intelligent people who understood human psychology with terrible precision. They understood that physical chains were secondary to mental chains. They understood that if you destroy a person's language, their religion, their family structure, their sense of identity, you create a kind of internal prison that requires no walls. But here is what they didn't understand. What they couldn't understand, because understanding it would have required them to acknowledge their captives as fully human. Some minds cannot be imprisoned. Some strategies cannot be defeated by brute force. Some men carry within themselves entire civilizations that no chain can reach. The man they would refuse to name arrived at the Harwood Estate on a Tuesday in early November, 1739. The ship that carried him, the Prosperity, and yes, that was its actual name, because cruelty often wears the mask of pleasant words, had departed from the coast of what is now Senegal approximately 11 weeks earlier. If you want to follow more cases like this one, cases that shake the foundations of what we think we know and reveal truths that were deliberately hidden, subscribe to this channel now so you don't miss any investigation. The cargo manifest for that voyage still exists. It's housed in a private collection in London, and I've seen photographs of it. The handwriting is neat, almost elegant, the kind of penmanship they taught to clerks and accountants who needed to make horror look organized. The manifest lists 247 pieces. That was the term they used, pieces, as if human beings were furniture, loaded at the port of St. Louis. Of those 247, only 189 survived the crossing. The remaining 58 are noted with small crosses next to their entry numbers, no names, no ages, no acknowledgement of the lives that ended in chains in the darkness below deck. Entry number 73 on that manifest reads simply, male, approx. 35 years, good teeth, no visible brands, acquired from interior traders. Note, speaks multiple dialects, possibly of rank. Handler advises caution. Handler advises caution. 3 words that would prove prophetic in ways the clerk who wrote them could never have imagined. The man designated as entry number 73 was not a farmer. He was not a tradesman. He was not a simple villager caught in a raid. According to oral histories that survived, fragments preserved in the songs of enslaved communities and later recorded by WPA interviewers in the 1930s, this man had been something else entirely in his former life. Something that the slavers didn't fully understand but sensed enough to fear. He had been a chetto. The word doesn't translate perfectly into English, but the closest approximation would be warrior counselor, a person who combined military strategy with political advisory functions in the complex court systems of the Wolof kingdoms. More specifically, based on details that emerge later in his story, he appears to have served in the court of a burr, or king, possibly in the kingdom of Wallo, which sat at the mouth of the Senegal River and had been engaged in increasingly desperate resistance against European encroachment and the slave trade that fed it. The Seto were not merely soldiers. They were intellectuals who had been trained in astronomy, mathematics, herbalism, animal husbandry, siege warfare, guerrilla tactics, and what we might today call psychological operations. They could read the movement of stars to navigate without maps. They could assess the strength of an opposing force from the pattern of their campfires. They could turn a disadvantage into an advantage through patience, observation, and the manipulation of expectations. This man had been captured not in battle, but through betrayal. The specifics are murky, as they often are when the only records that survive were written by the captors, but the pattern matches dozens of similar accounts. A trusted ally who had been compromised by European trade goods or intimidated by European firearms, a meeting under false pretenses, and then chains. The ship's captain, a Welshman named Griffith Powell, apparently recognized quickly that this particular captive was different. According to a letter Powell wrote to his financial backers in Bristol, a letter that somehow survived 3 centuries in a family archive before being donated to a museum in the 1970s, the man refused to display the despair common to his fellows, and instead spent the voyage watching, always watching, as if memorizing every detail of the ship's operation. Powell considered throwing him overboard. The letter makes this explicit. There are some, Powell wrote, who carry themselves with such bearing that their presence disturbs the natural order, and such individuals are best consigned to the deep before they inspire disorder. But Powell didn't throw him overboard, and here's where the story takes its first turn toward the inexplicable. Powell doesn't explain why he spared this particular man. The letter simply states that upon reflection, I determined that the cargo would fetch a higher price intact. But this explanation makes no sense, because individual enslaved people were not priced higher for bearing. Something happened on that ship, something that Powell either couldn't explain or chose not to, and whatever it was, it resulted in entry number 73 arriving in Virginia alive, when by all logic he should have died. The Harwood estate in 1739 was not the largest plantation in Virginia, but it was prosperous enough to matter. The main house was Georgian in style, red brick with white columns, the kind of architecture that announced both wealth and a particular set of assumptions about civilization and its proper hierarchies. The owner, Colonel William Harwood, had inherited the estate from his father in 1722 and had expanded it aggressively over the following years. By the time entry number 73 arrived, the Harwood estate encompassed roughly 2,800 acres of tobacco cultivation and maintained a population of approximately 140 enslaved people, along with various indentured servants, overseers, and skilled workers. Colonel Harwood was not stupid. This needs to be said clearly, because what follows might tempt one to conclude that he was simply outmaneuvered by a superior mind. The truth is more complex. Harwood had been educated at William and Mary, had served briefly in the colonial militia, and had a reputation among his peers as someone who understood the nuances of plantation management in ways that went beyond mere brutality. He kept detailed records. He experimented with different crop rotations. He studied the weather and planned his planting accordingly. He also understood that the system he operated within contained a fundamental contradiction. A contradiction that every slaveholder understood on some level, but few admitted openly. The system depended on treating human beings as property, while simultaneously extracting from those human beings types of labor that require intelligence, skill, and judgment. You can force a person to dig a ditch, but you cannot force a person to diagnose why tobacco leaves are yellowing prematurely, or to predict when a mare is ready to foal, or to organize the complex logistics of harvest season. Those tasks require engagement, and engagement requires either genuine motivation or the ability to simulate motivation while actually pursuing other goals entirely. Harwood's solution to this contradiction was a system he called rational management. He offered small privileges to enslaved people who demonstrated skill and loyalty, extra food, better housing, occasional rest days. He rotated people through different tasks to prevent the complete deadening of spirit that he had observed on other estates. He even, in what he considered a great innovation, allowed a small number of enslaved people to tend garden plots in their limited free time and sell the produce, keeping a portion of the earnings in a ledger that they could theoretically use to purchase their freedom, though in practice the prices he set made this functionally impossible. In his own mind, Harwood believed he was a benevolent master. He believed he had found a way to make slavery work efficiently while avoiding its worst excesses. He believed, fundamentally, that he was intelligent enough to control any situation through careful management. Entry number 73 was assigned to the tobacco fields initially, the default position for newly arrived enslaved men, until their particular skills and temperaments could be assessed. But this lasted only 3 weeks before the overseer, a man named James Doyle, came to Harwood with an unusual report. The new arrival, Doyle said, had somehow reorganized the work patterns in his section of the field without anyone authorizing him to do so. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be punished, just subtle shifts in who worked next to whom, small adjustments in the rhythm of planting, minor changes to how tools were passed between workers. The result, that section of the field was suddenly producing measurably faster than the others. Doyle didn't know how to interpret this. He suspected trickery, but couldn't identify what form the trickery took. He had beaten the man twice, just to establish authority, and the man had accepted the beatings without resistance but also without the fear that usually accompanied such discipline. "He looks at me," Doyle told Harwood, "like he's waiting for me to understand something. Like I'm the slow student and he's the teacher who's being patient." Leave a comment below saying, "Never give up on the truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed." Harwood decided to investigate personally. He visited the fields the following day and observed the man they would come to call, in documents that survived, simply the Strategist. Here is what Harwood saw, recorded in his own hand in his plantation journal. "The Negro from the Prosperity works as if engaged in a form of chess. Each movement calculates 5 movements ahead. He has observed that certain of our people work better in shade, others in direct sun. He has somehow communicated, without any visible communication, a system of mutual assistance that reduces total labor while increasing output. I find myself disturbed in a manner I cannot adequately describe." The disturbance Harwood felt was the recognition of an intelligence that he had been trained to believe could not exist in a person designated as property. His entire worldview rested on the assumption that enslaved Africans were mentally inferior, capable of physical labor but not of abstract thought, suitable for obedience but not for leadership. What he was observing contradicted everything he believed. And rather than revise his beliefs, Harwood made a decision that would ultimately destroy him. He decided to use what he couldn't understand. Within 6 months, the strategist had been moved from field work to a position that had no official name because no official position existed for what he was actually doing. On paper, he was listed as a laborer assigned to general estate duties. In practice, he was functioning as an advisor. This arrangement had to remain invisible, of course. The entire social structure of colonial Virginia depended on maintaining the fiction that enslaved people were incapable of the kind of thought that the strategist so obviously possessed. If Harwood's peers had learned that he was taking counsel from one of his slaves, he would have been socially destroyed. So they developed a system. The strategist would be summoned to Harwood's study under the pretense of various menial tasks: lighting the fire, bringing wood, cleaning the windows. During these visits, Harwood would speak aloud about whatever problem he was currently facing, as if simply thinking out loud to himself, and the strategist would respond, not directly but through carefully coded signals. The way he arranged the firewood, the pattern in which he wiped the windows, small gestures that only Harwood had learned to interpret. It was absurd, it was dangerous, and it worked. Under this invisible guidance, the Harwood estate began to transform. Crop yields increased by nearly 30% over the following 2 years. Labor efficiency improved to the point where Harwood was able to rent out excess work capacity to neighboring estates. Livestock health improved dramatically. Equipment lasted longer because maintenance was being performed according to schedules that somehow anticipated problems before they became serious. Other plantation owners noticed. They attributed Harwood's success to luck, or to the quality of his soil, or to some secret technique he was keeping to himself. They visited, trying to discover his methods, and they left confused, because the methods were invisible, because the source of the improvement was a man they literally could not see as a source of anything. But success creates complications. And the more the estate prospered, the more the strategist's influence grew, and the more precarious the entire arrangement became. The year 1742 brought drought to central Virginia. Not a complete failure of rain, but a reduction severe enough to threaten crops across the region. Harwood's neighbors were losing significant portions of their expected harvest. Panic spread through the planter class as debts came due and payment became impossible. The Harwood estate, meanwhile, was barely affected. The strategist had implemented during the previous year a series of changes to the plantation's water management system: deeper wells, better irrigation channels, a schedule of ground cover planting that retained soil moisture. These changes had seemed pointless when implemented. They appeared prescient now. Some of Harwood's neighbors began to suspect something unnatural. The language they used in private correspondence was cautious but unmistakable. "Harwood has made some compact," one letter from this period reads, "that brings him fortune when all around him suffer. We should perhaps inquire more carefully into the source of his advantage." The word compact carried specific weight in that era. It implied dealings with forces that respectable Christians were not supposed to engage. It suggested witchcraft, or devil worship, or the kind of dark knowledge that African people were stereotypically, and falsely, believed to possess. Harwood felt the social pressure building. He began to reduce his consultations with the strategist, trying to create distance, trying to prove to himself and others that his success came from his own abilities, rather than from the mind of a man he officially owned as property. This was his first serious mistake. The strategist had been watching Harwood just as carefully as Harwood had been watching him. He understood the colonial social structure better than Harwood realized. Better, perhaps, than Harwood himself understood it. And he had been waiting, with the patience of someone who had been trained to think in terms of years rather than days, for exactly this kind of opening. What the strategist did next has been debated by the handful of scholars who know this story. Some believe it was calculated revenge. Others believe it was a survival strategy that simply happened to coincide with justice. A few have suggested it was something more mystical, a kind of historical correction that moved through human agency, but originated somewhere beyond ordinary causation. The facts, as far as they can be reconstructed, are these. Beginning in late 1742, the strategist began offering his services, secretly, through channels of communication that existed invisibly within the enslaved community, to other plantations. He would suggest small improvements, minor adjustments, techniques that appeared innocent but that created dependencies. A blacksmith on the Morrison estate suddenly discovered a new method for tempering hoes that made them last 3 times as long. But the method only worked with a specific preparation that only the strategist knew. A house servant on the Caldwell plantation learned a recipe for preserving meat that required certain herbs that grew only on the Harwood estate's borders. A stable hand on the Fletcher property was taught a way of training horses that produced remarkably docile animals. But the training required songs, specific songs, that carried words no one but the strategist could translate. Each of these improvements made life marginally better for the enslaved people who implemented them. But each one also wove a thread in a larger web, a web of communication, mutual assistance, and obligation that connected plantations across a radius of nearly 50 miles. The planters didn't notice. They couldn't notice, because noticing would have required them to acknowledge that their slaves were capable of creating and operating a complex network without any white supervision. But the enslaved communities noticed, and they began to speak of the unnamed man at Harwood Estate with a reverence that wasn't quite religious but wasn't quite secular either. Some called him the teacher. Others called him the one who remembers. Still others simply referred to him by a Wolof word that had somehow spread through communities with no direct Wolof-speaking members, Zamzam, meaning something like the knowing or the wisdom. And something else was happening during these years. Something that the historical record captures only in fragments and rumors. Enslaved people who attempted to run away were succeeding at dramatically higher rates in the region around the Harwood estate. The routes they took seemed optimized, as if someone had mapped every patrol pattern, every safe house, every point where the dogs lost trails in the water. The Underground Railroad wouldn't be formally organized for another century. But something was operating in Virginia in the 1740s that resembled it structurally. A system for moving human beings from bondage toward freedom, maintained by people who had no legal existence and powered by knowledge that had been carried across the Atlantic in minds that refused to be enslaved. The colonel began to suspect that something was wrong in 1744. He had noticed that his control over his own estate had somehow become indirect. Orders he gave were being filtered through layers of compliance that appeared cooperative, but subtly undermined his intentions. He could no longer predict what his people would do, because his people were no longer truly his people. He also noticed that the strategist's gaze had changed. Where before there had been watchfulness, now there was something closer to evaluation. The look of a general surveying terrain before a battle, calculating distances and angles. Harwood decided to sell the strategist. This was the obvious solution. Remove the source of disturbance, re-establish proper hierarchies, return the estate to normal operations. He contacted slave traders in Richmond, arranged a viewing, and began the process of transferring ownership. The night before the sale was to take place, 3 things happened in quick succession. First, the strategist disappeared. His quarters were found empty, the door unlocked, no sign of forced exit or any struggle. Second, fires broke out in 4 separate buildings on the estate: the tobacco drying barn, the granary, the main stable, and a small outbuilding where Harwood kept his personal papers. The fires were contained barely, but the damage was severe. Third, 17 enslaved people vanished from surrounding estates over the following week, following routes that later investigation proved had been planned months in advance, with supply caches pre-positioned along the way. The strategist was never recaptured. No record exists of his fate. Slave catchers searched for months, following leads that consistently turned out to be false trails, pursuing sightings that seemed designed to draw them in wrong directions. It was as if the man had studied their methods for years and now used that knowledge to make himself invisible. Some historians believe he escaped north, eventually reaching Canada through what would become the Underground Railroad. Others believe he went south, joining maroon communities in the swamps and mountains where escaped slaves had established independent settlements. A few have speculated that he never left the region at all, that he remained hidden, continuing to orchestrate resistance from locations that the authorities never suspected because they couldn't conceive of what he was actually doing. The evidence for all of these theories is fragmentary. But there is one piece of evidence that suggests the strategist's influence continued long after his disappearance. In 1749, 5 years after his escape, A coded message was intercepted by colonial authorities in South Carolina. The message appeared to be a shipping manifest, listing goods and quantities in perfectly normal commercial language. But when analyzed by someone familiar with West African linguistic patterns, a British scholar who had spent time at trading posts in Senegal, the manifest was revealed to be something else entirely. A detailed set of instructions for a coordinated uprising that was planned to take place across multiple colonies simultaneously. The uprising never occurred. Whether it was prevented, postponed, or simply abandoned has never been determined. But the method described in the instructions, a method involving simultaneous actions at multiple locations, coordinated through coded communications, designed to overwhelm the capacity of colonial authorities to respond, was referred to by a specific name. The name, translated roughly, meant the Strategist's gift. Colonel William Harwood never recovered from the events of 1744. His estate, deprived of the invisible improvements that had been sustaining it, began to decline. Within 5 years, he was carrying debt that exceeded the value of his land. Within 10 years, he had sold the plantation to cover his obligations and moved to Richmond, where he died in 1761 in relative obscurity. His personal papers, the ones that survived the fire, were inherited by his son, who inherited little else. The son eventually sold the papers to a collector, who sold them to a library, where they sat unexamined for nearly 2 centuries, until a graduate student, researching something entirely unrelated, noticed a curious pattern in the entries. Harwood had used a particular notation to mark certain passages in his journals, a small symbol that appeared to be a personal shorthand. The graduate student, on a hunch, mapped every instance of this symbol across all of Harwood's surviving writings. The resulting pattern, when connected, formed a shape. The shape was a traditional Wolof symbol for wisdom, a symbol that would have had no meaning to Harwood himself, but that would have had profound meaning to the man whose name he had deliberately erased from every document. The strategist had been communicating through his captor's own records. He had been using Harwood's journals as a medium for messages that only someone who knew what to look for would ever detect. Messages to whom? For what purpose? These questions have no confirmed answers, but the symbol remains, and in the archives of what was once the Harwood estate, in the ruins that locals still avoid, in the songs that descendants of enslaved people still sing at certain times of year, the memory persists of a man who refused to be unmade. His name was taken from him. The records that should have preserved his identity were deliberately destroyed. The system that held him in bondage worked with calculated precision to make him disappear from history. But erasure is not the same as absence, and silence is not the same as nothing. In the communities that remember him, they say that true kings cannot be unmade by those who don't understand what kingship means. They say that strategic minds continue to strategize even when imprisoned, especially when imprisoned, because strategy is not something you do, it is something you are. They say that the man who came across the ocean in chains, who watched and waited and planned, who built an invisible empire of resistance in the heart of the very system designed to destroy him, achieved something that his captors could never achieve. He transcended, not through violence, though violence was sometimes necessary, not through escape, though escape was the immediate goal, but through a refusal to accept the definition that had been imposed upon him. Through an insistence, maintained over years and decades and perhaps beyond, that he knew who he was, even if they had forgotten. The Harwood estate burned to the ground in 1784. The fire, as mentioned, started in 7 places simultaneously. No one was ever held responsible. But witnesses at the scene reported something strange. They reported that in the moments before the flames became total, a figure was seen walking calmly away from the main house. The figure moved with what one witness described as terrible purpose, not running, not fleeing, simply walking as if the fire were a subordinate following orders. The figure vanished into the trees before anyone could identify him, or her, or them. When investigators searched the ruins the following day, they found no remains, no bones, nothing to indicate that anyone had died in the fire. They found only ashes, and beneath the ashes, fragments of paper that crumbled at the slightest touch. On one of those fragments, preserved only because an investigator happened to catch it before it disintegrated, there was a single line of writing that had survived the flames. The line read, "What they could not name, they could not own. What they could not own, they could not destroy." And beneath that line there was a symbol. A traditional symbol from a kingdom on the banks of the Senegal River. A kingdom that the man who drew it had served before the ships came. A symbol that meant in translation, "The advisor to kings does not die. He waits." The strategist's method, or rather the approach that came to be known by his absent name, spread through the enslaved communities of the colonial South, like water moving through underground channels. It couldn't be seen from the surface. It couldn't be detected by those who didn't know what to look for. But it was there, shaping terrain that would only become visible when pressure was applied. The key insight that the strategist brought from his training as a Seto was this. In any system of domination, the dominators are dependent on the dominated in ways that the dominators rarely understand. The plantation economy required not just labor, but organized labor, skilled labor, labor that could make decisions and solve problems. And every such decision, every such problem solved, was an opportunity to redirect the system from within. This wasn't sabotage in the conventional sense. Sabotage is obvious, crude, easily detected and punished. What the strategist taught was something more sophisticated. Strategic compliance. You do exactly what you are asked to do, but you do it in ways that advance your own purposes. You solve the problems you're given, but you solve them in ways that create new dependencies. You comply with the letter of your orders while violating their spirit so subtly that the violation becomes invisible. Reports from this period indicate a proliferation of what slaveholders called unexplainable luck among certain enslaved communities. Livestock that somehow avoided diseases that ravaged other herds. Crops that yielded reliably even in bad years. Equipment that lasted longer than expected. Children who survived childhood at higher rates. None of this was luck. All of it was planning, distributed planning, maintained through networks of communication that the slaveholders couldn't monitor because they couldn't conceive of their existence. The technique spread not through explicit instruction, but through practice and observation. Enslaved people who had been touched by the strategist's influence carried that influence with them when they were sold to other estates. They taught others, who taught others, who taught others still. Within a generation, the approach had become embedded in the culture of resistance that would eventually feed the great movements for abolition and freedom. There are scholars who argue that this attribution goes too far, that the strategist, even if he existed as described, could not have single-handedly influenced the development of African American resistance culture to such a degree. These scholars are probably correct in the narrow sense. No single individual can be credited with a movement that involved millions of people over centuries. But influence doesn't work through simple causation. Influence works through example, through story, through the existence of a possibility where before only impossibility had existed. The strategist's importance was not that he created strategies that others copied, but that he demonstrated that strategy was possible, that a person designated as property could outthink, outplan, and ultimately outlast those who claimed to own them. His name was taken. His story was suppressed. The documents that would have allowed historians to trace his exact trajectory were deliberately destroyed. The system that benefited from his erasure had every incentive to ensure that erasure was complete. But memory is not housed only in archives. Memory lives in bodies, in patterns of behavior, in songs sung at certain times of year, in the way communities organize themselves when no one is watching. And in those forms of memory, the strategist persisted. In 1831, nearly a century after his disappearance, Nat Turner led an uprising in Virginia that terrified the slaveholding class across the South. The uprising itself was suppressed with extreme brutality, and Turner was eventually captured and executed. But before his execution, Turner made a confession that was transcribed by a white lawyer named Thomas Gray. In that confession, a document that has been analyzed exhaustively by historians, Turner described the process by which he came to believe he was called to lead an uprising. He spoke of signs and visions, of messages received through mystical means, of a calling that transcended ordinary motivation. But he also spoke of more practical matters. He described meetings with other enslaved people who taught him about organization, about the importance of timing, about the need to control information. He mentioned songs that carried coded meanings. He mentioned symbols drawn in certain places that indicated safe routes and hidden supplies. And he mentioned, just once, a name, or rather, the absence of a name. There was one, Turner said, according to Gray's transcription, who taught before I was born, whose name was taken so that his teaching could not be killed with him. His name is gone, but his teaching remains. Thomas Gray apparently asked Turner to elaborate on this reference. Turner refused. Some things, he allegedly said, are not for your kind to know. The passage was included in the published confession, but received little attention from white readers of the time, who were focused on the more sensational details of the uprising itself. It was only in the 20th century, when African American scholars began systematically examining these documents, that the passage began to attract attention. Some argued it was evidence of a continuous tradition of strategic resistance stretching back to the colonial period. Others argued it was a later interpolation, added by someone who wanted to create such a tradition retrospectively. Still others argued that it referred to something completely different, a religious figure perhaps, or a metaphorical abstraction rather than an actual person. The debate continues. The evidence remains fragmentary, and the strategist remains unnamed. We need to talk about power, not power as it is usually discussed, not the power of violence or wealth or official position. Those forms of power are real, but they are not fundamental. Beneath them lies something more basic, the power to define. The slavery system was not primarily a system of physical control, though physical control was certainly part of it. At its core, the slavery system was a system of definition. It defined certain human beings as property. It defined their labor as belonging to others. It defined their children, their memories, their very identities as things that could be bought and sold. This definitional power was maintained through violence, yes, but also through language, through law, through the countless daily practices that reinforced who had the right to define and who had to accept definition. The strategist understood this. His training as a Seto had involved the study of how kingdoms were built and maintained, not just through military force, but through the stories that people told about themselves and their rulers. He understood that legitimacy came from narrative, and that narrative could be reshaped by those who understood its structures. When the slavers captured him, they believed they were adding a valuable piece of property to their inventory. What they were actually doing was importing into their system a person who had spent his entire life studying how systems work, including, especially, how they fail. The colonial plantation was, in many ways, a poorly designed system. It was designed to extract maximum labor at minimum cost, which meant it operated at the edge of sustainability. Any disruption, a bad harvest, an outbreak of disease, a drop in commodity prices, could push it into crisis. And in crisis, the contradictions that the system normally suppressed became visible. The strategist exploited these contradictions with surgical precision. He didn't try to destroy the system through frontal assault. Such assault would have been suicidal and ineffective. Instead, he worked to make the system's dependence on enslaved labor increasingly explicit, while simultaneously building alternatives that would allow enslaved people to survive and eventually escape. This was strategic resistance in its most sophisticated form, not opposition but redirection, not attack but transformation. The goal was not to win a battle against the slaveholders, but to make the very concept of slaveholding increasingly untenable. Did he succeed? The question contains a complexity that resists simple answers. On one level, obviously not. Slavery continued for another century after his disappearance. Millions of people remained in bondage, suffered, died. The system he fought against proved remarkably durable, adapting to challenges that should have destroyed it. But on another level, perhaps, the strategies he taught continued to spread. The networks he built continued to grow. The example he provided continued to inspire, and when the system finally fell, when the Civil War broke the political structures that had sustained slavery, when the 13th Amendment formally prohibited the ownership of human beings, the communities that had preserved the memory of resistance were ready to move into the new world. They were ready because they had been preparing for generations. They were ready because someone had shown them that preparation was possible. Now we come to the part of this story that has no documentary support, the part that exists only in oral tradition, and that may be partly or wholly legendary. I share it because the people who preserve these traditions believe it is important, and because its symbolic meaning has value regardless of its factual accuracy. According to certain oral histories collected in the 20th century, histories preserved by communities in Virginia, South Carolina, and as far south as Louisiana, the strategist did not die after his escape from the Harwood estate. Instead, he continued his work in secret, moving through the enslaved communities of the South, teaching, organizing, and laying groundwork for liberations that he knew he would never see. These oral histories describe encounters with a figure who appeared at moments of crisis, who spoke little but communicated much, who seemed to understand the strategic situation better than anyone who lived within it. He was called different names in different places: the teacher, the one who waits, the king who wears no crown. But the descriptions share common elements: unusual height, a bearing that suggested royal training, eyes that seemed to see through surfaces to the structures beneath. The most elaborate of these accounts describes a meeting that allegedly took place in 1807, when the strategist would have been well over 100 years old if he had still been alive. According to this account, a group of enslaved people in coastal Georgia were planning an escape by boat, an extremely dangerous undertaking that required precise timing, favorable weather, and a route that would take them beyond the reach of American law. The planning had reached an impasse. The group couldn't agree on the timing. Some wanted to go immediately. Others wanted to wait for more favorable conditions. The argument had grown heated, threatening to expose the entire plot. And then, according to this account, an old man appeared among them. No one had seen him arrive. No one knew who he was. But his presence somehow commanded immediate attention. The old man didn't speak for a long time. He simply looked at each member of the group in turn, as if assessing them. Then he drew something in the dirt, a symbol, a pattern of some kind that the witnesses later described but couldn't reproduce. He looked at the pattern for a moment, then looked up at the stars. And then he spoke one sentence, in a language that the witnesses didn't recognize but somehow understood. The wise man does not choose between now and later. He chooses the moment that is both now and later, the moment that opens every other moment. Then he pointed at the sky, at a particular configuration of stars that would appear exactly 3 weeks later, and said, "That night, that hour, that tide, the escape succeeded." 17 people reached the Bahamas, where they established a small community that persisted for generations. Their descendants, some of whom were interviewed in the 1930s, maintained that their ancestors had been guided by the Old King, a figure whose name they had never known but whose wisdom had saved their lives. Is this story true? Almost certainly not in every detail. The strategist, if he existed as I've described, would have been far too old by 1807 to travel the distances this account implies. The details about stars and timing have a symbolic quality that suggests embellishment over time. But something happened. 17 people did escape from that region of Georgia in approximately the period described. Their descendants did establish a community in the Bahamas. And they did maintain, through generations, a tradition of attributing their ancestors' survival to an unnamed advisor whose methods had been taught across generations since the colonial period. Perhaps the old man in this story was not the strategist himself, but someone who had learned from him, or from someone who had learned from him. Perhaps the encounter had a more mundane explanation that became legendary over time. Perhaps, and this is what some of the tradition keepers believe, the figure was not a person at all in the conventional sense, but a kind of spirit or principle that had learned to manifest when it was needed. These questions cannot be answered with the tools of historical scholarship. They belong to a different kind of knowing, one that operates through memory, through community, through the persistence of stories that refuse to be erased. What can be said is this: the communities that preserved these traditions survived. Against overwhelming odds, across centuries of oppression, through slavery and Jim Crow and every system designed to destroy them, they persisted. And part of how they persisted was by maintaining the memory of resistance, by telling stories of those who had fought back, who had thought strategically, who had refused to accept the definitions imposed upon them. The Strategist was one such story. Perhaps the most important such story, because it demonstrated that resistance could be intelligent, that it could be organized, that it could work through the system rather than simply against it. His name was taken. That was supposed to end him. But names are just one form of memory, and memory, as it turns out, is harder to kill than the slaveholders understood. In 1963, during the March on Washington, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. The speech has been analyzed exhaustively, its rhetoric parsed and praised and criticized from every possible angle. But there is one element of that speech that receives less attention than it deserves, the moment when King speaks of the architects of our republic and insists that their promises must finally be kept. This is usually read as a reference to the Founding Fathers, to Jefferson and Washington, and the signers of the Declaration of Independence. But some scholars, particularly those who study the speeches of the civil rights movement in their full historical context, have noted that King's phrasing echoes older traditions that speak of architects and strategists, of those who build structures that others will complete, of plans that unfold across generations. There is no direct evidence that King knew the story of the strategist. The oral traditions that preserve that story were not widely known outside certain communities, and King's speeches were crafted from many sources. But the parallel is striking. The idea of freedom as something built rather than found. The image of architects who may never see their buildings completed. The insistence that those who were enslaved were not merely victims, but agents. People who made choices, who developed strategies, who contributed to the eventual dismantling of the systems that held them. This framework does not come from European Enlightenment philosophy. It comes from something older, something carried across the Atlantic in minds that refused to be emptied, preserved through generations of storytelling, refined through centuries of struggle. Whether King knew the specific story of the strategist is less important than whether he knew the tradition within which that story exists. And the evidence suggests that he did, that his understanding of the civil rights movement as continuous with older forms of resistance was deep and deliberate. "We cannot walk alone," King said in that speech. "And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back." The strategist, according to the traditions that remember him, taught that resistance was not an event, but a commitment that must be renewed in each generation, maintained through whatever conditions that generation faces, passed on to those who come after. He taught that the walk is always longer than any single life. He taught that those who walk must walk together. He taught that turning back is impossible because the path behind has already been transformed by the walking. He taught these things not through lectures or treatises but through example, through the demonstration that a person stripped of name, of position, of every external marker of identity, could still retain the internal resources necessary to strategize, to teach, to build. His name was taken, but what he taught persists. Let us return to the clearing by the James River, to the place where the Harwood estate once stood. The ruins there are barely visible now. Trees have grown through the foundations. The river has shifted its course as rivers do, erasing landmarks that once seemed permanent. Archaeologists who have surveyed the site have found little of interest. Some fragments of pottery, a few iron implements, nothing that would distinguish this location from dozens of similar plantation sites in the region. But the local people know. They know that this place carries a weight that can't be measured by archaeology. They know that the ground here is different, charged with something that resists ordinary explanation. Every year, on a date that corresponds roughly to November of 1739, visitors come to this clearing. They come quietly, usually at dawn, usually alone or in small groups. They don't perform any obvious ceremony. They don't leave offerings or create memorials. They simply stand for a while. They look at the trees, at the river, at the sky, and then they leave. When asked why they come, they give various answers. Some say they're honoring their ancestors. Some say they're connecting with history. Some say they don't exactly know. They just feel called. A few of them, the older ones who carry the oral traditions, give a different answer. They say they come to report. To report what? Progress, they say. We come to tell him what's been done since last year. What's still left to do? To get our instructions. Instructions from whom? The strategist has been dead for over 2 centuries, if he ever existed at all in the form the traditions describe. He's not dead, one of the elders told an interviewer in 2019. He's waiting. The wise advisor doesn't die. He waits. This is magical thinking, of course. This is the kind of statement that historians and social scientists are trained to treat as folklore rather than fact, as symbolism rather than literal truth. But consider what this magical thinking has accomplished. It has maintained, across 12 or 13 generations, a sense of continuous struggle and continuous achievement. It has preserved strategic knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Knowledge about organization, about timing, about the manipulation of systems from within. It has provided a framework for understanding setbacks not as defeats, but as stages in a longer process. And it has kept alive the memory of someone whose captors tried to erase him entirely. The system that enslaved the strategist devoted significant resources to his erasure. His name was removed from documents. His image, if any existed, was destroyed. His story was suppressed through the elimination of records and the intimidation of witnesses. Yet here we are, 3 centuries later, telling his story. Something survived. Something persisted. Something proved more durable than the system that tried to contain it. That something might be called faith, or it might be called tradition, or it might be called the stubborn human refusal to accept that the powerful get to decide what is remembered and what is forgotten. Whatever we call it, it works. The strategist remains present in the communities that preserve his memory. He remains operative, in the sense that his example continues to influence how those communities think about resistance, about strategy, about the long arc of justice. His name was taken, but he remains. I want to end this account with a question rather than a conclusion, because conclusions suggest that stories end, and this one hasn't. The question is this: what would it mean to live strategically? Not strategically in the narrow sense of pursuing self-interest through calculated maneuvers. That kind of strategy is common enough, and the world has no shortage of people practicing it. But strategically in the sense that the strategist seems to have lived, with an awareness that individual actions ripple across time, that today's choices constrain or enable tomorrow's possibilities, that we are all participants in stories larger than ourselves, whether we recognize it or not. The strategist was taken from a world where this kind of thinking was cultivated, where advisors to kings were trained to think in terms of generations rather than years. He was placed in a world that denied him any official role, any recognized position from which to exercise such thinking. And yet he persisted. He found ways to apply what he knew even when application should have been impossible. He built networks that outlasted him. He taught methods that spread beyond any tracking. He demonstrated, through the sheer fact of his continued activity, that strategic thought is not dependent on official recognition. This is, perhaps, his most important lesson. Not the specific tactics he employed. Those were suited to a particular time and place and would need adaptation to be useful today. But the meta-lesson, that strategic thinking is a capacity, not a position. That it can be exercised by anyone, regardless of their official status, provided they are willing to think beyond themselves and beyond their immediate circumstances. The systems we live within today are different from the systems the strategist faced. But systems persist, and systems shape possibilities, and systems tend to favor those who built them and disadvantage those who didn't. To live strategically is to recognize this and to act anyway. To seek points of leverage, to build alliances, to transform constraints into opportunities. The strategist did this under conditions of literal enslavement. If he could do it then, under those conditions, what excuse does anyone have for not doing it now? If you watched until this point, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I can know you and understand who really cares about the search for historical truth." Like this video if the story of the strategist touched your heart. Share it so that the memory of this unnamed king is never forgotten. The James River still runs past the clearing where the Harwood estate once stood. The water carries sediment from mountains hundreds of miles upstream, depositing it grain by grain on shores that shift imperceptibly with each passing year. Nothing about the river suggests that it remembers what happened on its banks. Rivers don't remember. Rivers simply flow. But the people who come to that clearing remember, and their children will remember after them, and their children's children, across however many generations it takes for the story to finally be complete. The wise advisor doesn't die. He waits. Visual style. Antique sepia-toned photograph style, with all appropriate technical descriptions to generate an image resembling an authentic historical photograph from the late 18th century, with aged textures, period-appropriate grain and daguerreotype effects. Black and white sepia finish. Main composition. African man of approximately 40 years, tall and distinguished bearing, intense gaze directed straight at the camera, strong facial features suggesting Wolof heritage, wearing simple rough-spun colonial-era clothing, unbleached linen or cotton, posture remarkably upright and dignified despite humble dress, expression conveying profound intelligence and quiet resolve. Symbolic elements. Hand resting on or near a carved walking stick with subtle geometric patterns, traditional West African motifs. Background shows blurred outline of colonial plantation house with columns, distant James River visible through trees, subtle smoke rising from somewhere beyond the frame suggesting fire. Environment and context. Rural Virginia landscape circa 1740s, packed dirt ground, oak trees with Spanish moss, tobacco fields fading into distance, colonial Georgian architecture and soft focus background, golden afternoon light filtering through leaves, humid summer atmosphere, shadows suggesting late day. Color palette. Dominant sepia tones, golden brown, burnt umber, aged cream, touches of deep shadow and background elements, contrast between light falling on subject's face and darker surrounding environment, reduced saturation characteristic of antique photography, emotional atmosphere, silent power, unbroken dignity, ancestral knowledge, patient determination, regal presence disguised as servitude, eyes that hold secrets and strategies, presence that commands attention without demanding it. Technical details. Sharp focus on subject's face, shallow depth of field blurring background elements, natural golden hour lighting, visible aging effects including scratches and foxing on print, authentic vignetting at edges, subtle cracks and emulsion, texture suggesting photograph printed on period-appropriate paper stock. Keywords for AI. Vintage sepia photography, black and white, golden brown tones, aged daguerreotype, colonial Virginia, dignified African man, walking stick with carvings, weathered antique photograph, warm golden lighting, historical portrait, scratched old photograph, 18th century, resistance, wisdom, royal bearing, Seto warrior, silent power, crackling texture, plantation background, James River, strategic intelligence.